Ukraine's president and other European leaders descend on Washington, D.C. for a key meeting with Donald Trump. Air Canada flight attendants continue their strike despite being ordered back to work. Battle River Crowfoot voters give their verdict on Pierre Poilievre's bid to return to the House of Commons. All that and more straight ahead in episode 25 of the Rob Breakenridge Show.
The war is going to end. When it ends, I can't tell you, but the war is going to end, and this gentleman wants it to end, and Vladimir Putin wants it to end. I think the whole world is tired of it, and we're going to get it ended.
Well, greetings, friends, and thank you for joining us here on the Rob Breakenridge Show. So great to have you along with us. A lot of ground to cover on this episode, as you might imagine. We'll start, of course, with what happened in Washington, D.C. on Monday. The voice you just heard there, of course, that of U.S. President Donald Trump. Now, he appeared alongside Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky ahead of this meeting Monday at the White House in Washington. Other European leaders were there for that meeting. Now, this all comes on the heels of the meeting in Alaska on Friday between Donald Trump and Russia's President Vladimir Putin. Now, given that there were no concessions made by Vladimir Putin, he didn't have to agree to a ceasefire, there were no new sanctions or any other consequences for Russia, it's a little concerning as to what might come from this meeting today or where things might stand. Is this all going to end very badly for Ukraine? I think everyone wants to see peace, but what's necessary here, I think, is a meaningful, a just, and a lasting peace for Ukraine that does not reward Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, does not hand over territory to Russia that they have tried and failed to conquer. And what kind of security guarantees will there be for Ukraine if it is going to make concessions or give up land, if this is just about giving Vladimir Putin time to rebuild and rearm and continue this invasion at a later point, then it really isn't peace. So all eyes on Washington, D.C. on Monday to see what more might come from this meeting. And I guess at this point, late Monday, it's a little bit inconclusive. What we do have is a statement from U.S. President Donald Trump that he posted on social media on his Truth Social platform that kind of outlines what happened today and I guess where things go from here. So he starts off saying, I had a very good meeting with distinguished guests, and lists off everyone who was at this meeting in Washington. He says, during the meeting, we discussed security guarantees for Ukraine, which guarantees would be provided by the various European countries with a coordination with the United States of America. Everyone is happy about the possibility of peace for Russia-Ukraine. At the conclusion of the meetings, I called President Putin and began the arrangements for a meeting at a location to be determined between President Putin and President Zelensky. After that meeting takes place, we will have a trilateral meeting, which would be the two presidents plus myself. He says, again, this was a very good early step for a war that has been going on for almost 4 years. So the idea of Putin and Zelensky in a room together, well, that's interesting. And how's that going to work? Where's that even going to occur? And then Donald Trump getting involved in a trilateral meeting. We'll see, I guess, how this all comes about and whether anything of substance, anything of value can come from all of this. So joining us for some further thoughts. So we caught up earlier on Monday with Adam Zivo. Adam's a Canadian journalist, freelance writer, columnist at the National Post. He has spent a lot of time covering the war in Ukraine, has spent a lot of time in Ukraine, which is where we found him on Monday. You can read his latest on that meeting Friday in Alaska. It's up at nationalpost.com. Here's that conversation with Adam Zivo. Adam, so great to have you with us here.
Thanks for having me on the show.
What is the mood right now in Ukraine? I saw one poll out on Monday suggesting maybe Ukrainians are more willing to try to find a way to end this war. Maybe there's some fatigue with all of this, but of course some nervousness too at what this could all potentially mean right now.
There has been polling data showing for quite some time that the majority of Ukrainians are in favor of a negotiated settlement of this war. At the same time, the devil is in the details here. When you break down this data, you find that there are high levels of support for ending the war without making considerable land concessions. But when you specify that a peace agreement would involve, for example, giving away Crimea or giving up Luhansk and Donetsk or giving away Zaporizhia and Kherson, support for a peace negotiation really goes down. And there's a bit of an issue here because pro-Kremlin sycophants and propagandists will often use this polling data and present it without context to give the impression that Ukrainians just want to give up and want to have a peace deal right away by any means necessary. And then they use that to frame the Zelensky government as not representing the will of the people, even though Zelensky's approval ratings are around 65 to 70%.
There's this almost like perverse strategy by Putin, it seems, where he has stepped up the bombing and the missile and the drone attacks on Ukrainian civilian populations in recent months, maybe with the hope then of fueling that kind of perception that people just want this to end, and then using that to actually get more concessions in all of this.
Yeah, he's trying to break the will of the Ukrainian people. And a lot of this boils down to the developments of war technology during this conflict. So at the very beginning, drones were not a significant thing. The war that we're fighting right now is very different from the war from 3 years ago. Drones have become essential to warfare. And to give an anecdote that illustrates this, back in late 2022, I went to the Kharkiv area to follow some Canadian volunteers. And we went near the front lines. We even had 2 fighter jets pass over our heads. And I spoke with one of those volunteers last month, and he said that could never happen now. Because if you're within 100 or 50 kilometers of the front lines, you have to be very careful because a drone can hunt you and kill you. Now, at the very beginning, in late 2022, the Iranians provided the most important drone technology to the Russians, which is, would be these large-scale kamikaze drones, as opposed to, for example, smaller-scale FPV drones that are more commercially available. Now, in late 2022 or early 2023, Iran was essential here. These drones were still being developed. They were kind of slow. And then Russia took this Iranian technology and perfected it. So they made these drones faster, more maneuverable. Now they can fly higher, they can fly lower. And then they onshored production. So by early 2024, I think they were producing around, 500 drones a month. But by early 2025, those numbers began to rapidly increase. So they actually increased their drone production on a monthly level by tenfold or so. And from my understanding, earlier this summer, they were producing about 2,500 large kamikaze drones per month, plus an additional 2,500 decoy drones. So the idea here is that they launch large swarms of drones, 300 or 400 at a time, sometimes 500. And this was completely unheard of, a year and a half ago, 100 drones. That was a story. Now that's just a Friday. And they are hoping to overwhelm Ukraine's air defenses. Because if you have a drone like this, cost maybe $20,000, you're not going to intercept that with an anti-air missile, which is going to cost about $1 million. So normally you have to shoot them down with like machine guns, but then people get tired, right? And then following that, after the air defenses have been exhausted, then they launch things like ballistic missiles, right, which are much more lethal and much more difficult to intercept. And so civilian casualties have increased significantly over the past few months, coinciding with Trump's administration. Trump said he was going to end the killing. The killing has only gotten significantly worse under his watch. Yet Ukrainians remain resilient. Throughout Odessa, which is where I spend most of my time, I haven't seen any appetite to give up. People are fatigued. 3 years of war will do that to anyone. But they also understand the stakes involved. For example, in Odessa, we are 4 hours west of the front lines. So if you go just along the Black Sea coast, you get to Kherson eventually. That is a provincial capital. It was the only provincial capital that fell in 2022. It was then liberated 6 or 7 months into the war, and it sits on a river. And on the other side of the river, you have the Russians, and they send in drones, small little FPV drones, and they hunt civilians and they kill them every single day. And I've interviewed people who were under occupation from Kherson, and they talked about the arbitrary arrests and murders that happened there. And any journalist who you'll meet who works in Ukraine, if they're good at their job, because sometimes we do have grifters come through here, they will have interviewed people who have been under occupation, and universally the stories are horrifying. And Ukrainians are aware of that. They're not blind or deaf. They have families, members. Many of them have family members who are living under occupation. So no one wants to accept a full Russian occupation of the country because they know how awful that would be.
Right. And right now it seems like it's on the table, the idea of freezing everything in place so that these occupations and these circumstances that people are enduring, that would be locked in.
It would be, but what Putin's demanding is more than that. So let's go into the details of Putin's peace demands. And they've been quite consistent over the past 3 years. So back in early 2022, in March and April, you had the first round of Istanbul peace talks. And what the Russian negotiators demanded was that Ukraine give up all of its international alliances, severely reduce the size of its military, severely reduce the size of its weapons arsenals, and basically like demilitarize itself, cede Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson. And in exchange, Russia would put together a consortium of security guarantors to ensure that Ukraine is not invaded again. But the caveat of this system is that Russia wanted to create this system in a way where each guarantor had veto power over any military intervention from the other guarantors. Russia also wanted to be one of these guarantors. So essentially, they would create a system, a security system, where Russia would be able to veto any allies' defense of Ukraine. So it's a scam, right? Ukraine said no. Now, in the spring, when you had the second round of Istanbul negotiations, basically the same thing. Russia saying, we want you to cede these 4 territories, and we're not really going to give anything in return. We're going to promise that we're not going to invade you. Now, the important thing to remember here is that these 4 provinces, they're where the front lines primarily are. And consequently, that's where most of Ukraine's defensive fortifications are. So for Ukraine to hand over these territories, they would have to very abruptly abandon the vast majority of their defensive fortifications. And then they would have to rebuild them in neighboring oblasts, regions, where the territory is much less amenable to defense. And that takes time and a lot of money. And basically, they would just they would give up their shield. And for the promise that Russia wouldn't invade again, even though Russia has broken every single promise about invasion in the past before. Now, in the Alaska summit, what Putin did is that he narrowed his demands. And instead of demanding all 4 provinces, he demanded only Donetsk. Now, for Luhansk, it doesn't really matter because Russia already controls 99% of Luhansk, whereas he controls about 70% of Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson. So he said, okay, you give us Donetsk, and we will freeze the front lines in Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. Now, the thing is that Russia has not made any gains in quite some time in Zaporizhzhia or Kherson. So that concession, in quotation marks, is of very little value to the Ukrainians. But by giving up Donetsk, the Ukrainians would give up this belt of fortress cities, for example, Kramatorsk. These are several cities and small towns that exist in a cluster in the center of Donetsk, and they had been fortified over the course of 11 years because this invasion began in 2014. And it is the core of Ukraine's defense against the Eastern invasion. So if they give all of that up, they're giving up, they would have to give up their most important shield, and once again, in exchange for a written promise that Russia wouldn't invade. Steve Witkoff, who's the special envoy for the Trump administration in this case, he said, and this is ridiculous, this is the stupidest thing I have ever heard. He said that Russia will change its constitution, and its new constitution will say that they just won't invade. And look, I'm going to use some language that's not very PC, but like, this is retarded, right? This is a dictatorship. Constitutional changes are not a big problem. You can just change a constitution like this in Russia if you need to. The constitution guarantees, for example, free and fair elections. That doesn't exist in Russia. It guarantees freedom of speech. That doesn't exist either. It's a piece of toilet paper there. So why would the Americans think that this security guarantee would matter at all? So you can see here why the Ukrainians are very concerned about what was seemingly, discussed in the Alaska summit, and why today, as everyone is coming to Washington, they brought all of their allies. You brought the leaders of Germany, the United Kingdom, Italy, France, Finland, because the Finnish president apparently has a very good relationship with Trump. So they brought them all here to ensure that Trump doesn't impose this terrible peace in quotation marks, it's more of a surrender, upon Ukraine. But we'll see what happens.
Yeah, it was, you're looking back to Friday, and I mean, we'd heard all this talk that, Trump is becoming impatient and he's really frustrated with Vladimir Putin. He said there's going to be a ceasefire, or if there's no ceasefire, there's going to be some consequences. And then it just seemed like he kind of got rolled on Friday. There was no ceasefire. There are no consequences. And he just seemed almost like he was giddy to see Putin. It was an odd spectacle.
Yeah, I don't know. The relationship between them sometimes reminds me of, I don't know, like an abusive romantic relationship where Trump is like, I can fix him, right?
Yeah.
Oh, he's so good to me. He loves me. No, Putin, no, don't bomb them. Please stop. And then I think he began to realize that maybe this relationship didn't have as much mutual respect as he thought. And because they hadn't spoken in a while, there was an increased sense of alienation. There was an increased sense of resentment. His rhetoric really changed last month. But then they met in person again, and Trump was beaming like a child who was in the presence of one of his favorite celebrities. So I guess that in-person meeting temporarily resets Trump's perception of Putin, which is bad news for all of us.
And I don't know if Putin would have gone for it, but wouldn't it be something to have these two meetings kind of merged into one? I mean, the idea that Ukraine's future is going to be decided when they're not at the table anyway, I think is terrible. But sure, by all means, let's have Putin, but let's have Zelensky, let's have these European leaders, let's have the president. That would have been a different story, wouldn't it?
Putin doesn't want that. So for Russia, one of their main propaganda points is that the government of Ukraine is illegitimate. So they've tried to smear the Ukrainian government as neo-Nazis for years, which is absolute crap. Like anyone who's lived here or has even visited here for a few days can tell you that it's crap. And they basically say Zelensky's not a real president. Now they're using the fact that elections have been suspended during wartime to say that Zelensky cannot negotiate on behalf of Ukraine. Even though this is something that there's a lot of precedent for. I mean, the United Kingdom didn't have elections during war, same with Canada to a certain extent. You can't really have an election when people can bomb your polling stations. But Russia basically says, we're not going to negotiate with you because you're not equal to us. You're not a real government. You're not a valid stakeholder. And then this is their way of humiliating Ukraine, of marginalizing Kyiv, and of pushing for regime change so they can have a more malleable, more pro-Russian government installed in Kyiv that can turn Ukraine into a Russian protectorate or vassal state.
Which is why Ukraine wants the protection of NATO, similar to what Estonia and Latvia have, now Finland, of course. And this seems like a big red line for Vladimir Putin. So what do you make of this talk we're hearing now that NATO would be off the table, but there would be some kind of security guarantees that would be comparable, whatever that means, to Article 5?
I'll believe it when I see it, but the reason why I mentioned the consortium of security guarantors that was proposed in 2022 is that this makes me skeptical of this system that has been proposed today, because we don't know what this system will look like. Apparently, Putin proposed that China would be part of this system of guarantors, which is really weird. China is a close ally of Russia. So is the idea that Chinese troops would be stationed in Ukraine, which would be really absurd given the complicated politics here. But until we get more details, I don't feel overly optimistic here, especially with the rhetoric coming out of the White House recently. They've recently just began parroting Russian propaganda points. And so, look, if they come up with some kind of security guarantees that actually seem to work, that would be awesome. But if they don't, then that's bad. And actually, a thought just came to my head right now, which is that the great thing with Article 5 with NATO is that everyone has an interest in protecting it because they know it benefits them, right? So every member country benefits, and so they have an interest in supporting it. Whereas if you created an alternative system, a parallel system that only benefits Ukraine, there's really no reason for the other country. Like the other countries say, we don't want to intervene, and like this whole system has been like just falls apart. It doesn't harm them, right? In the same way that they would be harmed if they hollowed out NATO. So I think the Ukrainians are justifiably skeptical here. And there's been a history of them accepting Western-backed security guarantees that have been useless. The most notable one being the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which is where Ukraine, which had the third largest nuclear arsenal, which it inherited from the Soviet Union. And when I say inherited, it doesn't mean that it came from Russia. Like Ukraine had a lot of nuclear scientists. They built this arsenal, as part of the Soviet Union. They inherited it because they helped build it. And then they were forced to give it away by the United States and by Russia. And Russia and the United States both promised that they would protect Ukrainian sovereignty, and that didn't happen. So this could be just a repeat of that, where instead of just giving away, the hard power of their nuclear arsenal in exchange for security guarantees, they give away land and their fortress belt for security guarantees that in 3-4 years might not mean anything.
So in the meantime, Adam, if we get to a situation where Putin's not interested in real peace and Trump or the White House can at least finally, hopefully see that, is there an opportunity to change the circumstances on the ground to provide the kind of support that would at least, push the Russians back, stop these strikes, these missile and drone strikes on cities? Is there an opportunity then to help change the equation in that sense?
Well, I would say that Crimea is probably lost, and I don't see how the Ukrainians can take that back. And I think that would create the risk of nuclear war because the Russians see Crimea as theirs in a way that they don't see the other parts of Ukraine. I think that if there were a way to create a Russian collapse, you would have to focus on economic pressure, right? So right now, the Russian economy is sputtering. They were able to avoid a collapse earlier by spending all of their reserves and basically stimulating the economy by investing a whole bunch into defense production and related industries. And so they overheated their economy in the same way that you overheat an economy whenever you have a whole bunch of stimulus spending. And now that money is beginning to run out and they're on the cusp of a recession. So they have high inflation because they spent all of their money, and they have really high interest rates right now. I think like 20%, 21%, something absurd like that, but I haven't checked the numbers recently. So they have both of those factors combined. Inflation is still staying up. The reserves are mostly exhausted. If you disrupt their economy by bombing their economic infrastructure, like their oil infrastructure, that would be great. Then you can maybe force them to agree to a peace deal. That would be the most realistic option. And we're getting there slowly, but unfortunately, Trump he's delaying sanctions again and again and again.
Yeah. We'll see what comes of all of this. Much more, as mentioned, your latest at nationalpost.com. And folks can follow you on X, on Twitter, at Zivo. Adam, always do appreciate the insight on all this. Thanks so much for making some time for us here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, there you go. Our thanks again to Adam Zivo joining us from Ukraine. He's a Canadian writer and columnist who's covered this war extensively. You can read more at his website, adamzivo.com. We mentioned he is on Twitter or X at Zivo Adam, Z-I-V-O. And you can read more from him in the National Post as well, nationalpost.com. Now, we didn't get a press conference at the end of this meeting on Monday, which was odd because there was a press conference before the meeting involving U.S. President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Now, one of the questions put to Donald Trump, though, was about these reports that there would be some kind of security guarantees for Ukraine, something that it seems for now stops short of NATO membership for Ukraine, but maybe still something close to or akin to the security guarantees that exist for NATO members. So the question was put to the U.S. president about those kinds of guarantees. Here's his answer.
But we're going to work with Ukraine, we're going to work with everybody, and we're going to make sure that if there's peace, the peace is going to stay long-term. This is very long-term. We're not talking about a 2-year peace and then we end up in this mess again. We're going to make sure that everything's good. We'll work with Russia, we're going to work with Ukraine, and we're going to make sure it works. And I think if we can get to peace, it's going to work. I have no doubt about it.
All right. And then there was this question that was put to Ukraine's president. I think he handled it well, but the whole premise of the question was really bizarre and twisted. Like somehow this is Ukraine going off to war, starting a war somewhere else. Like the question, are you going to keep sending troops to die? Like, Ukraine's president is sending troops off to fight in Vietnam or something. They were invaded. And they're basically fighting for their survival. What else are they supposed to do?
Are you prepared to keep sending Ukrainian troops to their deaths for another couple years, or are you going to agree to redraw the maps?
Thank you for your question. So, first of all, we live under each day attacks. That today have been a lot of attacks and a lot of wounded people, and the child was dead, small one year and a half. So we need to stop this war, to stop Russia, and we need support American and European partners. And we will do our best for this. So, I think we show that we are strong people, and we supported the idea of the United States, personally of President Trump, to stop this war, to make a diplomatic way of finishing this war. And we are ready for trilateral, as President said. This is a good signal about trilateral. I think this is very good. Thank you.
All right, so again, that was all early Monday prior to this meeting at the White House involving Ukraine's president, of course, Donald Trump, and other European leaders. We'll see what more unfolds or what more we learn this week about next steps, and of course, in particular, when and how and where this meeting is going to take place between the presidents of Russia and Ukraine. And that's the latest on where things stand as of late Monday. All right, coming up in just a moment, we'll get the latest on the big story dominating the last few days in Canada, the strike by flight attendants at Air Canada. Now, it appeared as though maybe that was coming to a quick end after the federal government ordered flight attendants back to work. But their union says we're not going back to work despite that order. So we'll hear what the Prime Minister had to say about that on Monday. We'll hear what the head of the union had to say about where things stand on Monday. You're listening to The Rob Breakenridge Show. Well, certainly the big story in Canada as we kick off this new week remains the situation at Air Canada. Last week, flight attendants at Air Canada went on strike, and this week they remain on strike despite some developments that have occurred in the last few days. First of those developments was the decision by the federal government to order the Canada Industrial Relations Board to force flight attendants back to work and to send the two sides to binding arbitration. However, CUPE, which represents the flight attendants, says they're not going to go along with that. They are going to ignore the back-to-work order. They're not going to go to binding arbitration. They still want to talk to Air Canada, but they are going to remain on strike, they say. So then we had the Canada Industrial Relations Board on Monday ruling that this strike is now illegal. But at this point, nothing's really going to come of that. But it is a finding or a declaration that this is now an illegal strike. So that's where things stand as we enter this new week. And it does create a lot of uncertainty as to what's going to happen to air travel in Canada. And already, obviously, Air Canada has had to cancel all kinds of flights in response to this situation. So just when it seemed like maybe this was going to be resolved, we still have a situation where flight attendants are off the job, and we don't know how or when this is going to be resolved. Here's what Prime Minister Mark Carney said about the situation when he was asked about it Monday morning, just as he was headed in to a cabinet meeting.
I'll say the following. We recognize very much the critical role that flight attendants play in keeping Canadians and their families safe as they travel, comfortable as they travel. And it's important that they're compensated equitably at all times, fairly at all times. That's the reason why there have been negotiations over the course of the last 8 months. It is disappointing that those negotiations did not come to an agreement, and it was the judgment of both the union and the company that they were at an impasse. That's not my judgment, it's their judgment. And so we are in a situation where literally hundreds of thousands of Canadians and visitors to our country are being disrupted by this action. I urge both parties to resolve this as quickly as possible, and the Minister will have more to say. Minister Haji will have more to say later.
Okay, so I think the government's in a bit of a bind over the situation. Clearly, they were prepared to intervene and try to force flight attendants back to work and send the parties to binding arbitration. But what do they do now in response to this defiance from flight attendants or from CUPE that represents them? And it was interesting in the lead up to this because, certainly there's some survey results suggesting that Canadians are sympathetic to flight attendants and what they're going through and what they're asking for, the way in which they're paid, the strange system that exists where they're only paid when flights are in the air and not being paid, therefore, for this other work they're doing when planes are on the ground. Now, I mean, keep in mind that was all agreed to in the last collective bargaining agreement. But yeah, I think Canadians hear about these sorts of conditions. And look, flight attendants are pretty low down the food chain when it comes to staff at Air Canada compared to say, the executives. So I think there is a degree of sympathy. And it was interesting to see the federal Conservatives come to the defense of flight attendants in this whole situation, where you've got the Liberal government intervening to try to force them back to work. But now where does this go, right? Does this erode public sympathy if this is now considered or deemed to be an illegal strike? And what is the government prepared to do here? We've got this weird situation where, Air Canada can just sort of sit back and not agree and just wait for the federal government to intervene and try to force some binding arbitration here. We got this other situation, too, where the two main airlines in this country are essentially protected from foreign competition. And that works out pretty well for their bottom line. So what kind of an obligation does that present or create when it comes to dealing with these kinds of situations and making sure that their staff are looked after? Okay, so as mentioned, CUPE has said they're remaining on strike, regardless of what the CIRB has said. This on Monday was CUPE National President Mark Hancock speaking at a press conference and making it pretty clear that they're prepared to face the consequences of this decision, even if it means he ends up going to jail potentially.
We're going to stay strong. We're going to stay committed to making sure that those workers can do the job that they love doing and actually be able to afford a roof over their heads, to afford caring for their families. And if it means folks like me going to jail, then so be it. If it means our union being fined, then so be it. We're looking for a solution here. Our members want a solution here, but that solution has to be found at a bargaining table.
Now, a strike like this, or any kind of strike really, is designed to have an impact. You want the people to notice that you're off the job, and you not being on the job, that's something that's going to affect people. That's part of the point of going on strike. But in a situation like this, flight attendants are on strike, planes aren't flying, it's creating all kinds of headaches and chaos for travelers. And here's CUPE National President Mark Hancock acknowledging that impact and apologizing for that impact.
We are sorry that the public is caught up in this. We're sorry that people are stranded across the globe. That was not something that we wanted to be an impact. I was telling some folks yesterday, I'm staying here at this hotel, and went outside my room to come down, and there was a family sitting on one of those round couches they have in the hallways. They had their suitcases, and they looked distressed. And as a human being, as somebody that cares about folks, that had an impact on me. And we're hearing the stories, and we get the frustration that folks are having. There's life-changing events happening across the globe. There's people that have lost family members. There's medical appointments. There's vacation, and people need to be able to enjoy some time in the summer with their families. And we are, as Candace said, and as we've all said, we are sorry that they are being caught up in this.
All right, one more here from CUPE National President Mark Hancock. Says despite this whole situation, they're still ready to talk. They still want to talk with the airline.
I'm not sure when the last contact was made, but we have made it very clear that we're all still here at this hotel. And while we enjoy room service, we're not here for a holiday. We're not here for a vacation. We're here to do the work. We're here to negotiate a collective agreement. The employer is not here. We want to get a deal, but it takes two sides to commit to meeting and to working through some of the challenges that are facing us.
All right, well, just further to that comment, this is a Monday evening update here. Statement posted on Facebook by Air Canada, the Air Canada component of CUPE, says the talks between the union and the company have recommenced. Says the company reached out to the president today, and we move forward in our continued attempts to reach a fair deal. These meetings started this evening, and we'll keep everyone posted on how they move forward. At this time, the strike is still on, and the talks have just commenced. So that's the word from the union to the members. So they remain on strike, but it is interesting that despite ignoring the back-to-work order, despite the finding that the strike is illegal, the company has chosen to reach out. And we'll see if these talks go anywhere. All right, coming up in just a moment, we'll get the latest on the by-election Monday. Pretty key by-election for Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative Party in Battle River, Crowfoot in Alberta on Monday. This is the Rob Breakenridge Show. Okay, well, of course, the other big story in Canada is one that culminated Monday with the by-election in the Alberta federal riding of Battle River Crowfoot. I'm sure by now you're aware of the circumstances that prompted this by-election, and it goes back to the general election that was just, 4 months ago, not even. Not only did the Conservatives lose that election to the Liberals, but Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre lost his Ottawa seat to a Liberal challenger. Now, Pierre Poilievre intends on staying on as Conservative leader, and he'll face a leadership review coming up in, January it is. So that will dictate whether indeed he stays on as Conservative leader. But in the meantime, if he wants to stay on as leader, of course, he needs to be in Parliament. He needs a seat in the House of Commons. So they found a place for him to run. Damien Keurig was the MP re-elected in this riding in April. He agreed to step aside, creating a vacancy and giving Pierre Poilievre a place to run. The Prime Minister didn't delay once the resignation of Mr. Keurig was official, and then the by-election was called. So there's some challenges, though. I mean, Pierre Poilievre is at least originally from Calgary, so he does have Alberta roots. He doesn't live or hasn't lived in this riding. The challenge, though, as much as it is a rock-solid Conservative riding, of course, what's happening right now in Alberta is a whole conversation about Alberta's future in Canada, and a lot of that sort of burgeoning separatist sentiment can be found on the political right. So things have changed a little bit since before the election. And Pierre Poilievre was encountering a dynamic that the Conservatives or the Conservative leader hasn't really faced up until now. In addition, of course, you had the antics from the longest ballot committee with more than 200 registered candidates in this riding that necessitated Elections Canada creating this special write-in ballot. But really, there were the high expectations. Because, yes, this is a safe Conservative seat, but Damien Keurig won 83% of the vote in the last election. So everyone was watching to see, could Pierre Poilievre match that or come close to that, and what would be the implications if he didn't? So those were all the narratives surrounding this by-election. Monday, the voters had their say, and we got the results here Monday night. Pierre Poilievre has overcome the doubters and won over the voters of Battle River Crowfoot. As of late Monday evening, Poilievre was way ahead of the very large pack in the riding, sitting at around or just under 80% of the vote. So we'll see how much that changes once every single vote has been counted, but it's looked like Poilievre could match or come close to what the Conservatives did in April in this riding. And we shouldn't downplay that just because it's seen as a safe Conservative riding. As noted, there were all sorts of potential pitfalls for Poilievre in this riding and reasons why Conservative voters might be feeling a little apathetic. So yes, a weaker showing by Poilievre could have further weakened his leadership and raised all sorts of questions about his immediate future. So that's put to rest, at least for now. This by-election will soon be old news. Yes, Poilievre will have to figure out where he'll run in the next election, and he does owe this riding some representation through the rest of this term. The focus now will be on Parliament this fall and the showdown between Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre. Now, Carney's still enjoying a bit of a honeymoon still, but there are some vulnerabilities now showing. Now, this isn't Justin Trudeau that Poilievre is going up against. We'll see how much he's able to adjust his strategy now to a different opponent. But for now, for Poilievre, it's by-election mission accomplished. There's still work to do, obviously, but this was a clear win for him. So Pierre Poilievre will be back in Parliament this fall, for now probably putting some questions around his leadership to rest, and we look forward to seeing that first confrontation in the House between Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre. Well, listen, that's where we will leave it for this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Also, watch for a new episode of The Line Alberta on Wednesday, alberta.readtheline.ca, as we take a closer look at the Alberta provincial policing debate. We'll be back with another episode of this show for you on Friday. Much more at robbreckenridge.ca. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you soon. Take care.